So if you're anything like me, you've probably noticed that by spending a lot of time online, you kind of encounter a bunch of things that you start wondering what they actually mean. And one of these things that I encountered so far back was the concept of Hyperborea. Back in the day, it was not mainstream at all. It wasn't filled with memes, edits, and a whole slew of other crazy things. But it was just, a historical concept or a theory, conspiracy, several things you could really call it, but it was very interesting, and I really was interested in it. And I even covered it as like a little idea on an old video of mine, and I mentioned it throughout the history of the channel because it comes up a lot when you're kind of doing what I'm doing. But in the past year and a half, something happened. Now, how did this happen? I have no clue, but I really have noticed it, and there's no really like denying it. Definitely, Hyperborea went mainstream. It's not the only place that went mainstream. Agartha also went very clearly mainstream. Lemuria even to an extent went mainstream. So all these hidden, kind of like mysterious lands that nobody really knows anything about became mainstream, became memes, everybody's sharing, everybody's making edits. There's so many good memes, honestly. They crack me up, they're good. But something that I noticed is that people don't really know what they're laughing about, what they're laughing for. It's just they see the meme and go like, yeah, true. And honestly, fair. But I wonder how many people like learn about Hyperborea through bad sources or just people that just lie and just think it's something related to like the Germans in World War II, for example, instead of, the detailed and interesting history that it actually has. So in this video, which will be some sort of thematic video based on Hyperborea, I will try to explain what the entire thing about Hyperborea is, how it started, how the myth was created, how it developed throughout the years, throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia even, and how it got to the point where it is today. First of all, let's start from the basis. Hyperboreans. These were a mythical people who lived in the far north. This was said by the ancient Greeks. In fact, the word Hyperboreans comes from the Greek Hyperboreoi, and this comes from the ancient Greek hyper, meaning beyond, and Boreas, the god of the northern wind. Well, in that sense, Hyperborea just means beyond the north wind. So what's up with that? What does that even mean? Well, okay, so there's this guy, Herodotus, literally the first historian that mentions the concept of Hyperborea. And he's not the only one. Hesiod, Homer, the author, or the supposed author of the Odyssey and the Iliad, some of the best works of, I guess, anything that were ever created in humanity's history. And even Aristeas, back in the 7th century BC, believed that in the north of the Isidones, which were a people that were believed to be in modern-day Kazakh steppe, and even north of that, north of the people which were called the Arimaspians, which were believed to be some sort of cyclops, some sort of, one-eyed folks. And north of that, there was a land where griffins lived. Yes, griffins, the mythological animal. And even north of that, so, you're getting north, you actually get to Hyperborea, and where the Hyperboreans lived. Even Pindar, a famous Greek poet, thought that Perseus, the ancient Greek mythical hero, reached the Hyperboreans in one of his journeys. So, where exactly are these Hyperboreans? Or where exactly is Hyperborea? As you can kind of figure out, there's many different sources, and many different people throughout the ages kind of like have their own theory on where Hyperborea is actually located. So, the most important thing we had when it comes to the knowledge that came from the ancients was that they were north of the Riphean Mountains, which were considered the northern boundary of the known world. So nothing was known outside of them. Therefore, the Hyperboreans, as like even a concept, were unknown. Homer believed that they were in Dacia, a region that corresponds roughly to modern-day Romania, and that would become part of the Roman Empire throughout the ages afterwards. But so many more people disagree with this because they think it's too far south. So, if not in Dacia, where are they? Some ancient Greek scholars, like Antimachus, believe that the Riphean Mountains were the Alps, and they believe, therefore, that the Hyperboreans were most likely a Celtic tribe. So if you don't know what Celts or Celtic people are, well, if you've ever seen a ginger, most likely he is in some sort of sense Celtic. The Celtic people were a widespread group of people that lived in ancient Rome and ancient Greek times, and even afterwards. In fact, Irish, Welsh, Cornish, Scottish, all of these people are Celtic. And this theory that Hyperboreans were Celtic was also believed by Hecatus of Abdera, who thought that the Hyperborea region was just another way of calling the island of Britain. So there's all these people that believe it's in Britain, that believe it's like in Northeast Asia, that believe it's in Dacia, and a lot of these kind of get close to it, but the turning point was when Pomponius Mela, another historian, explained that to him, Hyperborea was situated not in some already known land, but in the further north part of the world, the Arctic. Yes, he believed it was literally North Pole. That's where Hyperborea was situated. And that's kind of what stuck. If you see maps of Hyperborea, and you've definitely seen this map of Hyperborea, you will very well know that people made it to be the center of the north. They made it to be this land divided by 4 rivers that was literally the entirety of the North Pole, so it was covered by ice, or at least it was believed to be, for the majority of the year. Mappers like Gerardus Mercator were the first to actually visualize Hyperborea as is most known today in this shape. By the time of the Romans, the real history and knowledge of Hyperborea had kind of scattered and gotten mixed up so much so that the Romans were recorded calling Hyperboreans both the Gauls of France, the Germanic barbarians of Germany, and the Scythians in the east. So at this point there was no consensus on actually who the Hyperboreans were. There were so many theories and so many ideas behind that nobody really actually knew what it was about. And despite this, there were people, like actual figures, that in history were called Hyperboreans. For example, there was a man who was said to have miraculous knowledge of medicine and the ability to cure people. He was known to the ancient Greeks as Abaris the Hyperborean. Praise of Apollo, the Greek god of the sun and medicine, also known by the Romans, and he was believed to spend time in Hyperborea in the winter months. And according to this theory, he granted this man, this Hyperborean, the powers to cure people and to be somewhat eternally alive, because another very popular theory was that the Hyperboreans were not regular humans, they were actually giants. Kind of like immortal giants, or at least giants that lived thousands of years. So already, even in the ancient times, we kind of had this concept of like non-human creatures, beings existing in the north of the world, which might sound not too crazy now, but when you think about it, back in the day, non-human beings were kind of scattered all around. They didn't really think there was one location like on top of the world where they lived. They created places like the Olympus mountain, for example, for the Greeks, where the gods resided, but it wasn't something that was, so specifical and so geographically accurate. So the entire concept of the Hyperboreans living in the far north of the world, the Arctic, was completely new and an invention by that time, or at least, if not an invention, something that was covered and forgotten afterwards. After the ancient classical times, the idea of Hyperborea kind of changed, it developed. In the Middle Ages and in the modern era, the people of Scandinavia thought of Hyperborea as the Roman and Greek version of the Norse homeland, claiming that since Hyperborea was described as always being sunny, despite being in a very frigid wasteland part of the world, it had to be in Scandinavia, as it was the only place that almost always had summers with eternal sunshine. In fact, despite, Scandinavia being very cold, the entire of the summer is usually with days that never end, or at least that end very shortly and restart very soon. Therefore, people in Scandinavia believed themselves to be in some sort of way the Hyperboreans, right? Moreover, with the advent of Gothicism, an ideology that saw in Swedes the descendants of the Goths that sacked and conquered Rome, Hyperboreans were elevated, and Hyperborea as a whole was conceived differently from these people. It was elevated to a once great Nordic empire in this perception. So at this point everybody was having their own theory about who the Hyperboreans were and how the modern people that inhabited the world correlated to these Hyperboreans. And this is the modern era, by the way. Modern era not in the sense that it came nowadays, modern in the historical sense, aka until roughly 1848 or 1815. Let's say the age of revolutions, right? Whilst in the age of exploration, of colonial explorations, the thought that people that lived in colder climates in Northwest Europe should colonize the Arctic Circle was born. By 1824, the society called the Hyperborean Roman Company was founded, and this company was pro the concept of Europeans who live in a certain climate in a certain area colonizing an area of the not European world that kind of resembled it. For example, like the Spaniards colonized South America, which is hot and warm just like Iberia, Spain, so should the French and the English, which have quote-unquote Hyperborean blood, colonize the parts of the world like Canada, the United States, or even Siberia to some extent. I guess that was related to the Russians more than the French and the English, but the concept still remains. Finally, Nietzsche, the famous philosopher, described his readers in the book The Antichrist as Hyperboreans, because they knew something that other people didn't. They knew how it felt to be away, alone, and cold, in some sense. I'm a bit paraphrasing here, so forgive me if I'm not completely correct about this one, but it was funny that, Nietzsche is talking about Hyperboreans. How popular were the Hyperboreans that Nietzsche was talking about them? Anyways, something else that is interesting is, if you've been watching this video, you have probably noticed that there's all these arts, all these paintings, all these beautiful drawings and art pieces that relate to Hyperborea. And if you're wondering what those are, well, you have nowhere to look but to the art of Vsevolod Ivanov. He was, or is, I guess, a Russian painter that specifies in drawing the past of Russia as the truth of Hyperborea, where Slavic folklore and mythology mix into these beautiful paintings of pre-Christian Russia. So every time you see these paintings, which are now so accustomed, so associated with Hyperborea to the point where there's no distinction, any meme about Hyperborea will have this image as a background. Every single one of those memes has this image. So everybody's thinking, looking at the mammoths, going like, yep, Hyperborea. Hyperborea. Or sometimes they get it wrong, they think Agartha, which, by the way, I will probably do a video on, because Agartha is another one of these places that people just don't know about. I mean, they just know about it for the memes, but they don't actually know where it comes from, so that's my job, I guess. But yeah, he is thought, this Ivanov, he is thought to be a member of the Rodonovary religion, a neo-pagan Slavic faith, which, influenced his art style. It has a lot of both alien themes, Atlantean themes. He kind of believes about the myth of Atlantis, as much of us do, and he also believes that Russia's past was covered up and it was, altered by the forces that govern the world today. He kind of is a believer in the idea of Tartaria as well, and some of these theories kind of like get together to the point where he thinks the real history of Russia is more akin to what he paints. And these paintings, for some reason, kind of like got locked in with Hyperborea itself, despite Hyperborea not even being the thing he is describing. He is very open about this being Russia, although there is a connection, because even some Russians believe that Hyperborea is located in Russia, or even is the entirety of Russia. For example, years ago, the governor of Murmansk, the Murmansk Oblast of Russia, claimed that the real Hyperborea was situated in Murmansk. And this is something I mentioned even in an older video of mine, so yeah, it is very well known that there's some sense of connection between Hyperborea and Russia, or the entirety of North Europe and North, I guess, Asia. I guess there's a kind of a continuity about it, because all these ancient sources talk about these ancient places being located there, and all these unknown people, and then, the things mix and people just go, you know what, this is whole Hyperborea, I guess, so that's just how it is nowadays. Or at least how many people believe it to be so. Finally, it's time to actually explain how Hyperborea got its modern, and this time I'm meaning the actual nowadays meaning, the modern conception, because it's really different. It has a lot more to do with what happens in the 20th century than what happened anywhere behind that time frame. So recapping, this concept of Hyperborea just changed throughout the eras, right? Thus it arrived heavily changed and much more complex by the 20th century, when it was once more picked up by several political groups and characters that sought to justify or explain their ideology through it. most notably in the field of political anthropology. There were highly controversial figures like the former futurist artist Julius Evola. He shared his belief that the Hyperboreans were the most advanced civilization in terms of knowledge and spirituality, and that the entire history of humanity since the end of the height of power of these Hyperboreans had been nothing but a de-evolution of the human species, as mixing with non-Hyperborean elements had weakened the descendants of the Hyperboreans, and humanity as a whole was becoming more animalistic with each generation that was separated from the Hyperborean motherland. This is the start of this different conception of Hyperborea, something much less related to the ancient people that existed in the north of the world, and much more related to some esoteric and highly controversial concepts of ethnicity and, dare I say, even of ethnos. Some during these times, like the Russian mystic H.P. Blavatsky, believed that the Hyperboreans reproduced asexually, and they were perfect beings that didn't need to reproduce like humans to do so, somewhat even non-intelligent because they were so high up in the conceptual scale of being that they weren't even comparable to human beings. You're seeing how this is more related to the modern conception of Hyperboreans, the memes about Hyperboreans being like these aliens, which by the way get confused a lot with another UFO religion that talks about these crazy blonde hair, blue-eyed aliens that have nothing to do with Hyperboreans, but for some reason now the things are associated, so there's nothing to do about it, and it all gets confused with Agartha as well, so it's a big mix at this point. But this conception was built in the 20th century, where these and other more esoteric views of the Hyperboreans popularized their presence more as an alien-like superior beings than simply another ancient civilization. Now, it's up to you to actually decide what Hyperboreans should be, if it's just one of the ancient civilizations of the world that was forgotten about, and that there's only traces about in history, or that it's something much more, something much less human and more powerful, maybe an alien civilization, maybe a entire different species of creature that inhabited the north of the world or wherever you want it to be. There's some that even think that Hyperboreans had much more to do with Egypt or the Fertile Crescent than places like Sweden or Norway, for example. With that said, I hope I did a good job at explaining what Hyperborea actually is, all the sources and all the actual accounts of Hyperborean history, and much more than that, just the concept of how it evolved in time, and got to the point where I'm seeing cats, driving cars in Hyperborea, which is just amazing, honestly, and I can't even complain, it's amazing. So that will be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if this video does well, I'll probably do one on Agartha as well. So see you next time.